"I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request. I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request." The air in the small, cramped apartment hung heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and the metallic tang of despair. Robert sat at his kitchen table, a chipped ceramic mug clutched in hands that felt strangely alien to him, calloused from years of gripping blueprints and inspection tools, but now trembling with an unfamiliar weakness. His gaze was fixed on a faded photograph tacked to the corkboard above the sink. A younger Robert, beaming, standing proudly in front of a newly completed civic center, his uniform crisp, his eyes alight with the unwavering belief in the good he could do. That man, that idealist, felt a million miles away now, a ghost from a life that had been systematically stripped from him, piece by agonizing piece. The narrator, a silent observer of Robert's unraveling, felt the palpable weight of his sorrow, a heavy cloak woven from betrayal and disillusionment. Robert's emotional state was a raw, exposed nerve, vibrating with a profound sense of injustice. Every breath felt like an effort, every thought a battle against the crushing weight of what he had lost. His shoulders, once broad and unyielding, now seemed to curve inward, as if trying to shrink away from the harsh glare of reality. The once bright spark in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a hollow, distant stare that spoke of sleepless nights and endless rumination. He was a man adrift, anchored only by the stubborn, defiant embers of a belief system that had, ironically, led to his downfall. He had given his life, his very essence, to the notion of upholding standards, of ensuring safety, of serving the public good. And in return, the public good, or at least the corrupt tendrils that throttled it, had devoured him whole. Robert was not just any city inspector. He was the city inspector, known for his meticulousness, his unbending adherence to regulations, his almost surgical precision in identifying flaws that others might overlook or, more nefariously, ignore. He had risen through the ranks of the Chicago City Construction Department on merit, his reputation as unblemished as the freshly poured concrete he so often scrutinized. He was a man of quiet dignity, his life a testament to the belief that integrity was not just a virtue, but a fundamental pillar upon which a just society was built. He lived modestly, his greatest joys derived from simple pleasures: a perfectly brewed cup of coffee at dawn, the satisfying click of a well-secured bolt, the knowledge that a building, under his watchful eye, would stand strong and safe for generations to come. His antithesis, the shadow that now loomed over his shattered world, was Vincent. Vincent, a name that now tasted like ash in Robert's mouth, was a developer whose ambition was as boundless as his ethics were non-existent. He was a man who moved through the city's power circles with an oily charm, his smiles never quite reaching his eyes, his words always carrying an unspoken promise of opportunity, or, failing that, threat. Vincent embodied everything Robert detested: the casual disregard for human safety, the cynical manipulation of regulations, the relentless pursuit of profit at any cost. Their paths had crossed many times, always with Vincent attempting to smooth over corners Robert knew needed to be sharp, always with Robert pushing back, unwavering. This time, however, Vincent had pushed harder, and Robert, in his stubborn refusal to bend, had broken. The central conflict, the very crucible that had forged Robert's current despair, had ignited in the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of a meeting room within the city construction department. Vincent, with an audacious confidence that still made Robert's stomach churn, had offered him a bribe. Not a subtle gesture, not a veiled suggestion, but a blunt, almost insulting offer of a substantial sum of money, enough to erase Robert's modest mortgage, to fund his daughter's college tuition, to grant him a comfort he had never actively sought. all in exchange for his signature on a stack of approval forms for buildings Robert knew, deep in his bones, were fundamentally unsafe. The structural integrity was compromised, the fire exits barely up to code, the materials substandard. His refusal, a quiet, resolute no, had been the inciting incident that set in motion the catastrophic chain of events that followed. The stakes were immediate and devastating. In the short term, it was financial ruin. The loss of his job, his steady income, meant the imminent threat of losing his home, of being unable to provide for his family. But the long-term stakes were far more insidious, far more corrosive to the soul. His reputation, meticulously built over decades, was utterly destroyed. His name, once synonymous with honesty, was now dragged through the mud, smeared with accusations of misconduct, incompetence, and even, preposterously, corruption. His faith in justice, in the very system he had dedicated his life to upholding, lay shattered around him, like so many shards of broken glass. He felt not just a personal loss, but a profound ideological one. The world, he realized with a sickening lurch, might not be as he had always believed it to be. The ideals he had clung to, the principles he had lived by, seemed to be nothing more than fragile illusions in a brutal, unforgiving reality. His eyes traced the outline of the photograph again, the younger Robert's smile mocking him from across the years. A single tear, hot and stinging, traced a path down his weathered cheek. He had refused a bribe and lost everything. He had stood firm and been knocked down. The silence in the apartment pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating, a constant reminder of the hollow echo where his life used to be. The story, however, was far from over. It was merely the dark, desolate valley before a climb he couldn't yet imagine, a climb that would redefine not only him, but perhaps the very landscape of integrity in a city that had forgotten its meaning. The days bled into weeks, each one a monotonous repetition of the previous, marked only by the growing despair that seemed to permeate the very fabric of Robert's existence. He was a man unmoored. His routine, once a comforting rhythm of purpose, now replaced by an aimless drift. Mornings, once heralded by the sharp, invigorating scent of coffee and the rustle of blueprints, now began with the dull ache of waking, the realization that there was no place to go, no task to accomplish, no standards to uphold. He would sit by the window, watching the city awaken, its towering structures a cruel reminder of the work he was no longer permitted to do, the safety he could no longer ensure. The hum of traffic, once a distant, familiar backdrop, now sounded like a mocking symphony of progress, continuing relentlessly without him. His backstory, a narrative of quiet dedication, now felt like a tragic prologue. Robert had grown up in a modest Chicago neighborhood, the son of a hard-working carpenter who instilled in him a deep respect for craftsmanship and a profound understanding of the importance of a solid foundation, both literally and figuratively. He joined the city construction department straight out of college, brimming with youthful idealism, eager to contribute to the city's growth, to be a guardian of its structural integrity. He had spent years learning the intricacies of building codes, the nuances of materials, the subtle signs of compromised safety. His colleagues, for the most part, respected him, even if some found his unwavering adherence to the rules a touch rigid. He was the kind of man you wanted inspecting the school your child attended, the hospital your loved one recovered in. He was reliable, predictable, and stubbornly ethical. His routine, before the fall, had been a tapestry woven with purpose. Early mornings, usually before dawn, spent reviewing schematics, cross-referencing permits. Then, out into the bustling, ever-changing landscape of Chicago, moving from site to site, his keen eyes scanning, his trained hands testing. The satisfying scratch of his pen against an inspection report, the stern but fair conversations with foremen, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done his part to keep the city safe. Evenings were for his family, his wife Clara, a woman of immense patience and quiet strength, and their daughter, Emily, whose dreams of college now felt like a crushing weight on Robert's already burdened shoulders. Their small apartment, filled with the warmth of Clara's cooking and Emily's cheerful chatter, had been his sanctuary. Now it felt like a cage, amplifying the silence of his shame. The relationship with his former colleagues was a particularly painful wound. A few, the truly honorable ones, had offered quiet words of support, hushed condolences in the hallways. But their voices were drowned out by the louder, more pervasive whispers of suspicion and condemnation. The official narrative, carefully crafted by Vincent's powerful connections and rubber-stamped by a spineless bureaucracy, painted Robert as a rogue employee, someone who had abused his position, perhaps even taken bribes himself, and was now being justly punished. The irony was a bitter pill. He who had refused corruption was now branded as corrupt. He who had sacrificed everything for truth was now living a lie. The few who truly believed in his innocence were powerless, their voices too soft to penetrate the thick wall of fabricated evidence and public opinion. Clara, his wife, bore the brunt of his despondency. Her face, usually serene, was now etched with worry, her eyes often red-rimmed from silent tears shed in the dark. She tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy to shield Emily from the harsh reality of their crumbling world. She would bring him cups of tea, gently suggest he read the newspaper, or encourage him to take a walk. Anything to break the suffocating inertia that had claimed him. But Robert could see the fear in her eyes, the quiet desperation that mirrored his own. He felt a profound guilt, a crushing responsibility for the pain he had inadvertently inflicted upon his loved ones. He had always been their protector, their provider. Now he was a burden, a source of worry, a symbol of their undoing. The thought was a sharp, twisting knife in his gut. Emily, vibrant and full of life, was a constant reminder of what was at stake. She was in her final year of high school, her acceptance letter to a prestigious university clutched tight in her hand. A beacon of hope that was slowly dimming under the shadow of their financial distress. Robert would watch her from the doorway of her room, her head bent over textbooks, her brow furrowed in concentration, and a wave of profound sadness would wash over him. He had promised her the world, or at least the opportunity to pursue her dreams. Now, those dreams felt like an extravagant luxury they could no longer afford. The silence between them grew longer, heavier, punctuated only by strained pleasantries. He knew she sensed the shift. The unspoken anxieties that hung in the air like a suffocating shroud. He longed to reassure her, to tell her everything would be all right. But the words felt hollow and untrue, catching in his throat like shards of glass. The inciting incident, the moment Vincent had laid the check on Robert's desk, played back in Robert's mind with agonizing clarity. The office had been quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long, dusty shadows across the polished floor. Vincent, impeccably dressed, had leaned back in his chair, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Robert," Vincent had begun, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Let's be practical. These buildings, they're not perfect. No building ever is. But they're good enough. And time, as you know, is money." Robert had felt a chill crawl up his spine, despite the warmth of the sun. He had seen this dance before. "Good enough isn't safe enough, Vincent. The structural reports are alarming. The fire safety protocols are a joke." His voice, though quiet, had been firm, unwavering. Vincent's smile had widened, a flash of gold from his expensive watch catching the light as he pushed a slim, leather-bound folder across the desk. Inside, a cashier's check, made out to Robert, for an amount that made his breath catch. Consider this a bonus for your efficiency, for understanding the practicalities of a bustling city, for being a team player. Robert's gaze had been fixed on the numbers, a dizzying sum that represented more than his annual salary. He had felt the tremor in his hands, the sudden, sharp temptation that flickered, brief but potent, in the darkest corner of his mind. Emily's college fund, Clara's worn-out car, the leaky roof. The possibilities had flashed before him, seductive and dangerous. But then, he had seen the faces of the families who would live in those buildings, the children who would play in their shadow, the elderly who would seek refuge within their walls. He had envisioned the cracks spreading, the fires igniting, the tragedy unfolding. The fleeting temptation had dissolved, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "I can't," Robert had said, his voice a low rumble, pushing the folder back across the desk. "My signature means safety, Vincent. It means lives. I won't compromise that." Vincent's smile had vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian stare. The air in the room had suddenly dropped several degrees. "A principled man, are we? How quaint. You know, Robert, principles can be very expensive, especially in this city." He had stood up, his height imposing, his shadow falling over Robert like a shroud. "You'll regret this, Robert. Believe me." And he had. He regretted the subsequent days, the fabricated reports, the witnesses, who suddenly remembered seeing Robert take envelopes, the internal investigation that was a sham from start to finish. He regretted the cold, impersonal letter of termination, the forced escort out of the building he had served for decades. He regretted the way his colleagues averted their eyes, the whispers that followed him, the sudden, deafening silence from his former network. He regretted the look on Clara's face when he told her, the way her hand had flown to her mouth, her eyes welling with unshed tears. He regretted seeing Emily's hopeful college brochures piled neatly on the kitchen counter, knowing they were now an impossible dream. The central conflict, the brutal, uneven battle between his unyielding integrity and Vincent's pervasive corruption, had played out not in a courtroom, but in the dark, shadowy backrooms of power. Robert had been framed with a precision that bespoke careful planning, a meticulous weaving of circumstantial evidence and perjured testimony. His attempts to defend himself, to present his own spotless record, had been met with cynical smiles and predetermined dismissals. The truth in this twisted reality was merely an inconvenience, easily buried under a mountain of lies. He had been fired, not just from his job, but from his life, from his identity. The stakes had been realized with a brutal efficiency. Financial ruin was now a looming specter, and his reputation, once a source of quiet pride, was shattered beyond recognition. His faith in justice, the very bedrock of his professional existence, had crumbled into dust. He was a disgraced worker, stripped bare, left to grapple with the bitter taste of an integrity that had cost him everything. The city, it seemed, had no place for men like him. Not anymore. A weight of his new reality pressed down on Robert, a physical burden that made every step heavy, every thought laborious. The days stretched into an endless, shapeless void, punctuated only by the relentless hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled sounds of the city he had once served. He tried to fill the emptiness with activity, with purpose. He fixed the leaky faucet, organized the cluttered garage, even attempted to bake bread, an endeavor that resulted in a dense, unyielding life that mirrored his own spirit. But these domestic tasks, once a pleasant diversion, now felt like desperate attempts to distract himself from the gaping chasm that had opened in his life. His mind, once sharp and focused, was now a battlefield of anxieties. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the darkness amplifying the accusations that echoed in his head. Corrupt, incompetent, unfit. Each word was a lash, stinging and raw. He replayed the conversations, the smiles, the sneers, searching for a sign he had missed, a moment where he could have turned the tide. But there was nothing. He had simply been Robert, doing his job, upholding his principles, and for that, he had been systematically dismantled. The unfairness of it all was a suffocating blanket, smothering any flicker of hope. He would clench his fists, his knuckles white, a silent scream building in his chest, a desperate longing for someone, anyone, to truly see him, to understand the truth that had been so cruelly distorted. Clara, ever resilient, had taken on extra shifts at the community center, her gentle hands now working longer, harder, to bridge the ever-widening financial gap. Her quiet strength was a constant, unspoken reproach to Robert's despondency. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, the worry lines etched deeper around her mouth, and a fresh wave of guilt would wash over him. He wanted to help, to contribute, but every attempt to find work was met with polite refusals, averted gazes, and the unspoken weight of his tarnished name. The construction industry, a tight-knit community, had effectively blacklisted him. He was a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. Emily, bless her heart, tried to remain optimistic. She spent hours researching scholarships, grants, and student loans. Her youthful determination a painful contrast to Robert's own growing cynicism. He would hear her on the phone, her voice bright and hopeful, talking to university admissions officers, and he would retreat further into himself, unable to face the stark reality that her dreams, once so tangible, were now hanging by the thinnest of threads. He felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him, not just for himself, but for the future he had inadvertently stolen from his daughter. He was supposed to be her rock, her provider, her unwavering support. Instead, he was a stumbling block, a source of profound uncertainty. One afternoon, a letter arrived, plain white envelope, no return address. Robert, his hands still trembling slightly, opened it to find a single, anonymously typed sentence. Look into the Westview Heights project. Vincent has cut corners there, too. There's a reporter, Sarah Jenkins, at the Chicago Tribune. She might listen. No signature, no further explanation. Just a cryptic clue, a fragile thread of hope in the suffocating darkness. Robert stared at the words, his heart beginning to pound a forgotten rhythm. Westview Heights. He remembered the project, a sprawling complex of luxury condominiums, still under construction. He had been on the verge of inspecting it when his life had imploded. The thought of Vincent continuing his unscrupulous practices, unchecked, unpunished, fueled a flicker of righteous anger he hadn't felt in weeks. It was a dangerous thought, a risky path. He had already lost everything by standing up. What more could he lose? But then, what if this was a chance? A chance, however slim, to reclaim not just his name, but his purpose? He spent the next few days in a quiet frenzy, a man possessed. He retrieved old city planning documents, cross-referenced them with public records he could still access online, searching for anything related to Westview Heights. His inspector's mind, dormant for too long, slowly began to awaken, piecing together fragments of information. He found subtle discrepancies, unusual permit amendments, and a disturbing pattern of last-minute material substitutions that, on their own, might seem innocuous, but when viewed through the lens of Vincent's history, painted a sinister picture. The details were elusive, hidden deep within a bureaucratic labyrinth, but Robert's practiced eye began to discern the faint outlines of a larger deception. He saw the familiar fingerprints of Vincent's cost-cutting measures, the almost imperceptible compromises that, when accumulated, could lead to catastrophic failure. He remembered the specific feeling of the concrete mix at another one of Vincent's sites, the subtle grit that indicated a lower-grade aggregate, the slightly off-color hue that suggested a cheaper, less durable cement. He recalled the way a particular steel beam had sounded when tapped, a hollow resonance that spoke of inadequate thickness, not the solid thud of a truly robust structure. These were the minute details, the almost intuitive observations that only years of hands-on experience could cultivate. He had always trusted his senses, and now those senses were screaming warnings about Westview Heights, even without him having physically set foot on the site. The thought of contacting a reporter sailed him with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating defiance. He had always avoided the media, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But now, his work had been silenced, his voice stolen. This, perhaps, was the only way to be heard. He found Sarah Jenkins's name online, a rising star at the Tribune, known for her tenacious investigative journalism and her uncompromising pursuit of truth. Her articles were sharp, incisive, and often ruffled the feathers of the powerful. She seemed like the antithesis of the corrupt system that had swallowed him whole. He debated for days, the anonymous letter a crumpled ball in his pocket. What if it was a trap? What if it led to further humiliation, further ruin? He couldn't bear the thought of putting Clara and Emily through more pain. But the image of Vincent's smug face, the memory of his cold, triumphant smile, ignited a fire in Robert's belly that refused to be extinguished. He had to try. For Emily. For Clara. For the ghost of the principled man he used to be. For the city that deserved better. One rainy Tuesday morning, his heart pounding a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, Robert walked into the imposing glass-fronted building of the Chicago Tribune. The newsroom was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, clattering keyboards, and hushed conversations, a stark contrast to the quiet despair of his apartment. He felt utterly out of place, a relic from a bygone era, his worn jacket and tired eyes standing out amidst the hurried energy of the journalists. He asked for Sarah Jenkins at the reception desk, his voice a little hoarser than usual. Sarah Jenkins was not what he expected. She was younger than he had imagined, with a sharp, intelligent gaze and an intensity that crackled around her like static electricity. Her office was a controlled mess, stacks of papers vying for space with half-empty coffee cups and a perpetually blinking computer screen. She looked up as Robert was ushered in, her expression a careful blend of curiosity and skepticism. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice clear and direct, without preamble, "my assistant said you have something urgent. Something about city construction." Robert nodded, his throat suddenly dry. He placed the crumpled letter and his hastily compiled notes on her desk, the faint smell of old paper and ink filling the air. He began to speak, slowly at first, his voice raspy, then gaining momentum as the dam of suppressed anger and injustice began to break. He told her everything: the bribe, his refusal, the framing, the loss of his job, the destruction of his reputation. He spoke of Vincent, of the Westview Heights project, of the subtle but deadly shortcuts that could cost lives. He poured out his soul, every detail, every nuance, every gut feeling he had ignored at his peril. Sarah listened, her face unreadable, her eyes never leaving his. She asked probing questions, sharp and incisive, cutting through his emotional narrative to the cold, hard facts. She meticulously reviewed his notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. Robert watched her, a knot of hope and fear tightening in his stomach. Was she believing him, or was she, like everyone else, seeing only a disgraced man, desperate to salvage his shattered life? Finally, she leaned back in her chair, a long, thoughtful silence stretching between them. The sounds of the newsroom faded into a distant hum. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "And you have no hard proof, only circumstantial evidence and your word against a very powerful man." Robert met her gaze, his own eyes burning with an intensity he hadn't known he still possessed. "I have my integrity, Miss Jenkins," he said, the words ringing with a quiet defiance. "And I have the truth. It's buried, but it's there. I know it." Sarah studied him for another long moment, her eyes searching his, as if trying to peer into the very depths of his soul. Then a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "All right, Mr. Peterson," she said, a hint of steel in her voice. "Tell me everything you know about Westview Heights, every single detail, every suspicion. We're going to dig, and if there's even a sliver of truth to what you're saying, we're going to expose it." A fragile seed of hope, long dormant, began to sprout within Robert's chest. The air in the office, though still thick with the scent of old paper, suddenly felt a little lighter, a little easier to breathe. He had taken the first step, a leap of faith into the unknown, trusting a stranger with the last vestiges of his shattered life. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in months, Robert felt a faint stir of purpose, a whisper of a possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, life might yet return what it had so cruelly taken. The journey ahead would be arduous, fraught with peril and uncertainty. But he was no longer alone in the fight. He had found an unlikely ally, a beacon in the encroaching darkness, and with her, a glimmer of a chance for redemption. The investigation that followed was a grueling, painstaking process, a labyrinthine journey through a world of obscured facts and carefully constructed lies. Sarah Jenkins, true to her word, proved to be an unwavering force, her journalistic instincts as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. She plunged into the depths of the city's bureaucratic records, her tireless energy a stark contrast to Robert's weary resignation. Robert, for his part, became her reluctant guide, his encyclopedic knowledge of building codes and construction practices proving invaluable. He pored over blueprints, reviewed endless spreadsheets, and recounted his experiences with Vincent with a meticulous detail that only a deeply wronged man could possess. Their collaboration became a strange, symbiotic dance. Robert, initially hesitant and guarded, slowly began to shed his shell of despair. He found a renewed sense of purpose in aiding Sarah, in meticulously pointing out the subtle discrepancies in materials manifests, the suspicious changes in engineering plans, the almost imperceptible deviations from standard safety protocols that, to an untrained eye, would seem innocuous. He would spend hours with her, tracing lines on architectural drawings, explaining the critical importance of a particular steel alloy, or the precise load-bearing capacity of a concrete slab. His voice, once barely a whisper, regained some of its old authority when discussing the integrity of a structure. Sarah, in turn, offered Robert a lifeline. She listened without judgment, her keen mind sifting through his emotional outpourings for the kernels of verifiable truth. She saw past the tarnished reputation, past the public narrative, to the honest, principled man underneath. Her belief in him, unspoken but evident in her relentless pursuit of justice, slowly began to mend the gaping wounds in Robert's faith. She introduced him to her network of sources, disgruntled former employees, cautious whistleblowers, and even a few anonymous city officials who, fearing Vincent's wrath, spoke only in hushed tones and shadowed hallways, but whose information corroborated Robert's claims. The Westview Heights project became their focal point. Sarah and Robert discovered a pattern of systematic cost-cutting, where cheaper, inferior materials were substituted for specified, high-grade ones. They uncovered a web of shell corporations and offshore accounts used by Vincent to funnel funds, obscuring the true financial trail. The structural integrity of the luxury condominiums, designed to house hundreds of affluent families, was dangerously compromised. The fire suppression systems were inadequate, The electrical wiring shortcuts posed a significant fire hazard, and the very foundation, meant to withstand the harsh Chicago winters, showed signs of critical weaknesses. The potential for a catastrophic failure, a disaster waiting to happen, sent a chill down Robert's spine every time he thought about it. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day of hitting dead ends, Robert and Sarah sat in a quiet corner of a dimly lit diner, the clatter of plates and hushed conversations forming a comforting backdrop. Robert stirred his coffee, the steam warming his hands. "It's like he built a house of cards, Sarah," he murmured, his voice heavy with a grim realization. "And if one card falls, the whole thing collapses." Sarah nodded, her gaze distant. "And he's been doing it for years, hasn't he? We're just seeing the culmination of a career built on deceit." "The anonymous tip you received was crucial, Robert. Someone else knew. Someone else had the courage to speak up, even anonymously." "Courage," Robert scoffed softly, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "It cost me everything." Sarah reached across the table, her hand briefly touching his arm. Her touch was gentle but firm. "It did cost you everything, Robert. And that's precisely why your story is so powerful. You stood alone, you refused to bend, and now we have a chance to not only clear your name, but to prevent a potential tragedy." She paused, her eyes meeting his, bright with an unwavering resolve. "Are you ready for this, Robert? Because once we publish, there's no turning back. Vincent will come after us with everything he has." Robert looked at her, truly looked at her, this young woman who had staked her career on his word. He saw not just a journalist, but an ally, a kindred spirit in the fight for truth. He thought of Clara, her weary but determined face, and Emily, her dreams still flickering, however faintly. He thought of the anonymous tipster, the quiet act of defiance that had set this whole process in motion. He thought of the thousands of people who would unknowingly live in Vincent's unsafe buildings. A deep wellspring of strength, long dormant, began to surge within him. He took a deep breath, a slow, deliberate intake of air that filled his lungs with a renewed sense of purpose. "I'm ready, Sarah," he said, his voice clear and resonant, devoid of its former tremor. "Let's expose him." The publication of Sarah Jenkins's exposé in the Chicago Tribune was an earthquake that shook the city to its core. The headline screamed across the front page, bold and unforgiving, "City Inspector Framed, Developer's Empire Built on Lies and Danger." Below it, a detailed, meticulously researched account of Vincent's fraudulent practices, the compromised structural integrity of Westview Heights, and the shocking story of Robert Peterson, the honest inspector who had been sacrificed to protect a criminal enterprise. It was a journalistic tour de force, a masterpiece of investigative reporting, backed by irrefutable evidence that Sarah and Robert had painstakingly unearthed. The initial reaction was a mixture of shock, outrage, and disbelief. The city, accustomed to its comfortable narratives, struggled to reconcile the image of a respected developer with the damning evidence of his corruption. But the evidence was too compelling, too meticulously presented to be dismissed. Sarah had not only provided copies of altered blueprints and falsified material receipts, but also included anonymous testimonies from terrified subcontractors and former employees who, emboldened by the article, slowly began to come forward. The article also highlighted the specific, minute details that Robert had found so alarming: the use of cheaper, less fire-resistant insulation behind the walls, the insufficient number of load-bearing columns in the underground parking structure, the substitution of standard-grade rebar with thinner, weaker alternatives. These were not grand, obvious acts of sabotage, but rather 1,000 small, insidious compromises that, when taken together, created a ticking time bomb. The narrative meticulously explained how Robert, with his decades of experience, had been uniquely positioned to spot these dangerous shortcuts, and why his refusal to compromise had made him a target. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Citizens flooded the Tribune with letters and calls demanding accountability. Architectural firms and engineering associations issued statements of concern. Consumer advocacy groups launched their own investigations. The story became a national sensation, a potent symbol of corporate greed and governmental complicity. Vincent, initially dismissive, quickly found himself engulfed in a firestorm. His carefully constructed empire began to crumble. Investors pulled out, construction halted, and his once loyal political allies suddenly found it convenient to distance themselves. The city council, facing immense public pressure, launched an independent inquiry, promising a full and transparent investigation. Robert, once a pariah, was now a public figure, albeit a reluctant one. His face, once associated with disgrace, was now plastered across newspapers and television screens, a symbol of integrity and courage. He was inundated with calls from reporters, invitations to speak, and letters of support from strangers who had been moved by his story. Clara answered most of the calls, her voice now filled with a quiet pride that Robert hadn't heard in months. Emily, her eyes shining with admiration, would read the articles aloud, her voice trembling with emotion. The weight of shame that had burdened their family for so long began to lift, replaced by a surge of vindication. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Armed with Sarah's meticulously compiled evidence and Robert's expert testimony, the city's prosecutor built an ironclad case against Vincent. The key scene, the pivotal moment of the twist, unfolded in a packed courtroom, the air thick with anticipation. Robert sat quietly, observing the drama unfold, a sense of detached awe washing over him. Sarah Jenkins, called as a witness, presented her findings with an unflappable calm that belied the intensity of the moment. She projected detailed schematics onto a large screen, pointing out the discrepancies Robert had helped her identify, explaining in layman's terms how Vincent's cost-cutting measures had jeopardized the lives of future residents. She played snippets of recorded phone calls, obtained through anonymous sources, where Vincent could be heard explicitly ordering the use of substandard materials. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. Then, Robert was called to the stand. He walked to the witness box with a quiet dignity, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom, meeting Vincent's furious, desperate eyes for a brief, unwavering moment. He spoke with a clear, resonant voice, recounting the bribe, his refusal, and the subsequent framing. He explained in intricate detail the specific dangers inherent in the Westview Heights construction, illustrating with diagrams and his own expert knowledge the precise points of structural weakness, the imminent risks of fire, the potential for catastrophic failure. He spoke not with anger, but with a somber authority, a man recounting a devastating truth. He was no longer just a victim. He was an expert witness, a guardian of public safety, his words carrying the undeniable weight of experience and integrity. His testimony was compelling, delivered with a quiet conviction that resonated through the courtroom. He spoke of the sacred trust between an inspector and the public, of the solemn responsibility to ensure that buildings were not just structures of steel and concrete, but safe havens for human lives. He spoke of the subtle art of compromise versus the dangerous act of cutting corners, distinguishing between the two with a clarity that left no room for doubt. He even brought a sample of the substandard concrete aggregate they had discovered on site, crumbling it between his fingers to demonstrate its poor quality, a visceral, tangible piece of evidence that brought the abstract dangers into terrifying focus. Vincent's defense crumbled under the weight of the evidence and Robert's unshakable testimony. He was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, endangerment, and corruption. The judge, in a stern address, condemned his actions as a betrayal of public trust, a cynical exploitation of the very foundations of the city. Vincent, once a titan of industry, was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of furious, defeated rage. A verdict sent a wave of relief and vindication through Robert. He felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years, as if a crushing burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. His name was cleared, his integrity restored. The truth, in the end, had indeed prevailed. The city, eager to rectify its past wrongs and eager to project an image of renewed commitment to ethics, moved swiftly. Robert was not only reinstated to his former position as city inspector, but with honors. The mayor himself, in a public ceremony, issued a heartfelt apology, acknowledging the grave injustice he had suffered and praising his unwavering courage. He was offered a promotion, a significant raise, and a mandate to help overhaul the city's inspection protocols, to implement stricter oversight, and to ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. Robert, once disgraced, was now transformed. He was no longer just an inspector. He was a symbol of integrity in a world often swayed by corruption, a beacon of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. His character arc had completed its profound journey, from a man stripped of everything to a figure of inspiration, a testament to the enduring power of ethical conviction. He had lost everything, but life, in its strange and circuitous way, had returned it double, not just in material terms, but in something far more valuable: a profound sense of vindication, a renewed faith in justice, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his principles, far from being an expensive luxury, were the very foundation upon which a truly just society could be built. He looked out at the bustling city, the skyscrapers reaching for the sky, and saw not just steel and glass, but the potential for a new beginning, a brighter, more honest future, a city that learned from its mistakes, built on the unwavering strength of truth. A dust settled, the headlines faded, and the city began its slow, arduous process of rebuilding trust. Robert, however, remained a steadfast presence, his quiet influence now extending far beyond the confines of the city construction department. He accepted the mayor's offer, transitioning from a field inspector to a newly created role: the city's ethics advisor for urban development. It was a position tailored to his unique experience, his unwavering principles, and his profound understanding of where the system could and often did break down. His office, no longer the small, functional space of an inspector, was now a corner suite with a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, a constant reminder of the sprawling metropolis he was committed to safeguarding. The hum of the city, once a mocking symphony of progress without him, now sounded like a dynamic chorus of potential, a canvas upon which he could help paint a more honest future. He spent his days developing new, more stringent inspection protocols, training a new generation of inspectors to be as meticulous and unyielding as he was, and serving as a vigilant watchdog against any whisper of corruption. His wisdom, hard-earned through immense personal suffering, became an invaluable resource for city officials, developers, and the public alike. Clara, her eyes now sparkling with a joy that had been absent for too long, often visited him at his new office, bringing him his favorite homemade cookies. She would sit quietly, watching him work, a gentle smile playing on her lips. The unspoken anxieties that had once shadowed their home were gone, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of peace and pride. Their apartment, once a cage of despair, was now a sanctuary of shared triumph, filled with laughter and the quiet hum of a life rebuilt. Emily, having secured a full scholarship to her dream university, was thriving. She pursued her studies with a renewed vigor, her father's story a constant inspiration, a living testament to the power of integrity. She would call him often, her voice bright, sharing her academic successes, her questions about ethics and justice now imbued with a deeper, more personal understanding. Robert would listen, his heart swelling with a quiet contentment, knowing that he had not only salvaged her dreams, but had also instilled in her an invaluable lesson that transcended any textbook. Robert's transformation was profound. He was no longer just the disgraced worker, nor merely the symbol of integrity. He had become an embodiment of resilience, a living example that even in the darkest of times, truth, when pursued with unwavering courage, could not only reclaim what was lost, but could also build something far greater, far more enduring. He learned that integrity was not just about refusing a bribe. It was about the relentless, often painful journey of standing by one's convictions, even when the world conspired to break you. It was about the quiet strength to rebuild, not just a career, but a faith, a purpose, a future. He often thought about Vincent, now languishing in a federal prison, his empire dismantled, his name synonymous with disgrace. There was no joy in Robert's heart, only a somber understanding of the consequences of unchecked greed. Justice, slow and often circuitous, had ultimately found its way. As the sun set over the magnificent Chicago skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the gleaming towers, Robert would stand by his window, his gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of the city. He saw the new construction, the bustling streets, the countless lives lived within the structures he had once inspected, and now helped to oversee. He felt a profound sense of peace, a deep gratitude for the second chance he had been given, and an unwavering commitment to the principles that had cost him everything, only to return it richly and abundantly, a testament to the enduring power of an honest heart. He had lost everything, but in that loss, he had found something far more precious, himself, refined and strengthened in the crucible of adversity, ready to guide his city towards a future built on foundations of truth and unwavering ethical standards. Thank you for staying until the end. If this emotionally explosive narrative left you breathless and forever transformed, like it now and share it immediately with someone who loves life-changing tales. Before everyone misses this bombshell, tell me in the comments what city you are listening to this story from.